and to answer any questions about Pittsfield Greater Green. This has been sort of, a dream of mine, this project. I've been talking with my partners and the people in my public health department at the Planning Commission for years about trying to incorporate environmental sustainability, climate justice into health research and health implementation programs. And I'll tell you a little bit about how this project came to be. But really, we're 18 months into a 5-year planning process, and it's very exciting to finally be doing some of this work. I just wanted to give everybody a little bit of an overview of what the Regional Planning Commission is. We are a quasi-state agency that provides professional planning services to the 32 municipalities in Berkshire County. We provide things like transportation planning, economic development. I'm in the public health department, environmental management, and I think there's one more department. Oh, community and housing planning. And my background is in, actually, funny enough, reproductive epidemiology. It's epidemiology and just the science of disease and health outcomes is something, data I've always been really, really interested in. But when I graduated, I realized that I didn't want to be crunching data all day behind a computer. I'd rather be taking the studies, interpreting them appropriately, and applying them to the community needs that I saw. So this project is a 5-year, strictly a planning project. It's not an implementation project. It's funded through the Massachusetts Department of Public Health through determination of need funds. And our funded partners are Central Berkshire Habitat for Humanity. Does anybody ever work with them, or have you heard of Habitat for Humanity? Yeah, they do a lot of great housing work, but also community engagement and work around lifting residents up in the community. Berkshire Bridges, Working Cities, associated with Habitat. 18 Degrees, which is a regional family and child services agency, in the city of Pittsfield. So Greater Green is an environmental and climate-focused initiative. We're really focused on making this an extremely inclusive process for residents. This is something that is really at the core of our project, is through a lot of typical planning work and community work, you have planners from out of state, out of the community coming in, doing their assessment and making recommendations for what should be done or what could meet the gaps or needs in a community. And we, in this project, are really deferring to the residents and the community members and the people who work in the neighborhoods as the experts. They live in these communities. They experience these communities. Lived experience to us is really kind of like this vital, honestly, like a expertise that we must tap into if we're going to make sustainable programming, if we're going, to see any sort of actualization to the plans that we're working with. So we're really centering residents in this program, and we're focusing specifically in the Morningside and Westside neighborhoods in Pittsfield. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why we're doing that. So while this is really like an environmental, racial and climate justice focused project, it's not just strictly on looking at the people and the green environment. We're also considering factors of the built environment that affect people's quality of life. Things like housing, things like structural racism at the city level, at the community level, generational trauma, historical context of people's economic lives in Pittsfield. And so we're really looking at, trying to look at the whole picture of the person and the person's experience through this program. And so over time, we had to pick an objective. So our initiative really does hope to increase access to green space, improve quality of green space, and then in general improve quality of life and life expectancy for the residents in these two neighborhoods. And then, because this is a planning project, it's about $1 million over 5 years. We're not able to do any implementation. Our funder has been really careful about making sure this is all going into community organizing and planning work. So throughout this process, we will be exploring funding opportunities, grant opportunities to implement some of the project ideas that we come up with. Again, so our operating principle is really that we as planners, don't come into the community with a prescription of ideas and solutions. That's not our job here. That's often our job as professional planners coming into the community. We often have training or knowledge that allows us to facilitate a process or to execute a plan for a community that meets their needs really well. But in this case, we are really deferring to the residents as the experts. And so as planners, we've decided that our role in this really is to set up the framework for which residents and community representatives can collaboratively develop their priorities and visions. And we do that through a very professional, facilitated structure, but all the while making it very accessible for residents. So I want to tell you a little bit about why we picked the Morningside and Westside, and just go over some data about the Morningside and Westside specifically. So the Morningside and Westside are significantly more racially diverse than the rest of the city. People of color make up about 31% of the population in the two neighborhoods, and about 11% of the population in the rest of the city. And so here we're looking at household income on this graph on the left, and then on the right we'll go over median household income and poverty rates. But on the left-hand side you see percent of households. It ranges from 0% to 18%. And then on the bottom here we're looking at ranges of household income. The orange is Morningside and Westside, and blue is the remainder of Pittsfield. So you can see there's many more people in the Morningside, indicated by the orange lines, falling into these lower household income categories. And then as you increase the range, the remainder of Pittsfield families fall into the higher income categories. So it's a pretty distinct trend going on there. In the Morningside and Westside, the median household income is much less than half of the median household income in the remainder of the city. The family poverty rate is triple, and families receiving SNAP is quadruple, if not a little more. This was the area of data where, when we were exploring this grant opportunity with residents in the community through some community meetings at the library and with Habitat for Humanity, we came across this data, which was put together by Mark Malloy in the BRPC office. He's our data and IT manager. And we were just looking at life expectancy by neighborhood. And you can see here, we have the markers on the map. It might be difficult for you to see. But residents of the Morningside and Westside tend to live about 10 to 13 years less than residents of other neighborhoods in Pittsfield. And while we do expect people living in extreme poverty to be living fewer years of life, this is such an extreme difference based in such a small geographic area that it sort of put up all of our red flags and kind of sent out our alarms, there's really, really something happening here. And as public health people, that we know, it's this isn't due to individual health behaviors. A lot of people really like to tie some of this information to drug overdoses or alcohol use or risky behavior, some other type of stigmatizing category that they want to put somebody into. But we know that this is kind of a mosaic of factors causing such an extreme life expectancy difference. And because race is absolutely a factor here, we know that structural racism is certainly at play. And is anybody here from Pittsfield? Have you spent time in the Morningside or West Side and driven through?
I live in the West Side.
You live in the West Side, right? So you know, like driving through the West Side compared to Southeast is an extremely different experience. And so you can imagine, as your life experience has, you know, giving you the experience that it's just very different. The housing quality is different, sidewalk quality, road quality. The economy is different. There's almost no business zoning in the West Side specifically. In the Morningside, there is more business zoning, but low access to food, things like that, is very different neighborhood to neighborhood in Pittsfield. And then we started looking at data related to heat in poverty in urban areas. And there's this really good study. I encourage you to check it out if you haven't. It's not super new. This was a study that we referenced for the grant application. But it was done by NPR and the University of Maryland. And it looked at the correlation between household income and heat indexes in major cities and major urban areas. And they found that living in poverty, people living in poverty, those areas were highly correlated with hotter temperatures. And you might think like, well, yeah, there's less trees, there's less airflow between buildings, there's more pavement, so the pavement is preventing the redistribution of water back into the air to cool it. And there's a million factors at play here. But one of the things we do know that higher temperatures, even just a few degrees, can exacerbate health conditions like COPD, diabetes, and mental health conditions. Even just a few degrees can make somebody's heart medication work less well. And you can see even just a few degrees hotter might cause somebody to have a heart attack, when if they lived in a cooler neighborhood, they wouldn't have otherwise had that heart attack managed by their medication. Another condition that's exacerbated is mental health conditions. So your medication for things like depression, anxiety, and suicide ideation work less well in hotter temperatures. We know this could be the case also for things like diabetes, and certainly asthma, where like it's not just heat, but it's also air pollution, especially indoor air quality, can exacerbate asthma. So, like I said, there's a lot of factors at play. It's not just trees. It's not just heat. It's not just structural racism. It's not just well-paved roads and access to parks. Actually, the Morningside and West Side have a lot of parks, a lot of green parks located within them, but we're still seeing these outcomes going on. So I want to talk a little bit about General Electric. Well, I don't really want to center the discussion. It's it's impossible to ignore kind of the historical context that GE brought into the economy of Pittsfield, and especially the Morningside in Pittsfield. So I'll tell you a little bit about, I'm sure you've all heard about the PCB contamination in the Housatonic River. I'll get a little bit into that. So General Electric came to Pittsfield in the early 1900s, and by the 40s employed over 13,000 people, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a huge driver of economic prosperity, especially in Pittsfield. These are well-paying jobs. GE was one of the first workplaces to offer healthcare benefits. So as you can, and there was things like golf courses, and Bosque got night lighting to accommodate nighttime skiing in Pittsfield as part of the GE workforce coming in. And so GE occupied the William Stanley Business Park right in the Morningside neighborhood. In the late 1970s, the federal government banned PCB use. which was used to make GE's transformers, which is one of their major manufactured products at the William Stanley Business Park. And in combination with GE outsourcing, and a lot of factories outsourcing their factory jobs to other parts of the world to cut costs, Pittsfield began to lose many of these well-paying jobs. And it took, I think, a series of about 3 decades for just about all of the jobs to be gone in Pittsfield. That's a pretty quick, it's not just 13,000 workers, that's 13,000 families that were depending on that income. And there weren't a lot of manufacturing or factory jobs to fall back into in the Berkshires and in Pittsfield. So there was a huge, huge economic downturn and depression because of that. And GE is responsible for estimated between 100,000 and 600,000 pounds of PCBs dumped into the Housatonic River. There was a 13-year cleanup that ensued in GE that cost, or in Pittsfield for the Housatonic River, that cost GE $613 million, and there's still this process happening for the communities in more southern county. Contamination is still a major issue, regardless of the cleanup. And one thing that is really frustrating, I would say, for residents of the West Side and Morningside, and just residents of Pittsfield and surrounding communities in general, is that GE donated many Berkshire County towns what they called clean fill, but was actually majorly contaminated with PCBs. This is information from the Berkshire Environmental Action Team, which is a big partner with us at Brady Green. So a lot of people could potentially have this fill in their backyards where their kids play, where they grow their food, and not really know. Their animals can be exposed to it, their children can certainly be exposed to it. And PCBs, we're so concerned about them. I'm sure you've all done some research in PCBs, but they cause cancer, they have immune effects, they cause reproductive harm, neurological effects, endocrine or hormonal issues in the body, and a variety of other health issues. And PCBs can get into your system in a lot of ways, just like ingestion. You can, if you fish in the Housatonic River downstream, you're advised to not eat the fish because the PCBs sit in your fat cells and takes your body a really, really long time to work out of the system. And fish and turtles and frogs and will all be contaminated with that. So just reference some of the sources. The EPA website actually has a lot of really good information specifically about the GE PCB contamination. The beatnews.org from Berkshire Environmental Action Team. And I just worked with some students from Williams College to develop a really comprehensive report on the 3-decade history of the Morningside and West Side. You can find it, I can actually share that link. The report isn't available yet, but the presentation is. I'll reference that further too. But we know that the departure of GE is just one factor. There's a lot of things that have changed in Pittsfield over time since GE's departure, but we know it was definitely a major driver of economic depression in Pittsfield, and a lot of the workers from GE lived in the Morningside. And a lot of people, when GE left, they left, either with GE or for another job somewhere else, and sold their houses, and housing values plummeted. And according to a recent study conducted with my Williams students, they analyzed a ton of data from Berkshire benchmarks and census data from the last 30 years. Despite the influx of the creative economy and general recovery of many jobs, in Pittsfield, many residents of the Morningside and West Side particularly continue to experience ongoing economic crisis. The gap actually in economic hardship has increased between the West Side and Morningside and the rest of Pittsfield over time. So we're seeing, residents of the Morningside and West Side hit harder and harder over time. It's just not recovering. And even if you break it down, so the Morningside has 2 census tracts. The Tyler Street district, which is more of like the business district, is doing much better in terms of income and economic stability than the rest of the Morningside, which is where many of the residential areas of the Morningside are, around like Silver Lake and Beacon's old plant at the Williams County Business Park. So the combination of generational poverty, prolonged housing insecurity and economic hardship, and potential exposure to PCBs and other indoor and outdoor environmental contaminants are likely major contributors to the low life expectancy in the Morningside and West Side neighborhoods. And I do want to say too, one thing I was really surprised about when I started meeting with residents of the Morningside and West Side was their desire to compost and garden directly at their home, to join community gardens and to start community gardens. And this is great, but one of the questions that hangs over everybody's head is, does my backyard of the property I rent have PCB contamination? Like, I need to test the soil, or I need to invest in raised beds. Those are expensive. Purchasing soil for significant gardens is really expensive. And so it's a huge barrier that is enough to stop somebody from growing a garden, which sounds small but really is big. So one of the things we really focused on is bringing residents to the table and incorporating equity into our program from the get-go. So our work plan for this project is a 5-year work plan broken down by yearly work plans and goals. And at every point in our work plan, we assess either the initiative or the project that we're working on and how it could potentially, looking at through a perspective of how this could potentially harm the population that we're trying to serve. And getting that advising from the residents themselves, from racial justice and environmental justice groups, to make sure we're not just creating more harm than good, but we're actually actively evaluating and assessing. At each point, we have an opportunity to make sure that equity is increased, as we go along. This is nothing we're doing here is set in stone, which is very interesting for a long-term planning project. We're flexible, we're responsive to residents' ideas and needs, and we have sort of our core initiatives going on, but it's all filled in by resident input. So our structure really is based on having an equal power balance at the table with residents with shared decision-making and priorities, community representatives, and community-based organizations. So nobody has a greater vote or a more impactful vote, I would say, who works at the city versus who lives in the Morningside neighborhood. We're all major contributors, besides me, I'm just a facilitator. But we really dig deep and explore not just the issues that residents bring to the table, but how balancing power in a decision-making process for things like people's health and the green environment can create conflict between people who usually make decisions versus who we want to be influencing decisions made. So that's one of the interesting things we're sort of actively working through. Because it's not just, you can't just declare that everybody shares power and then it happens. There's certainly roadblocks that come along, and so we're developing what do we call it? I think it's like a community, I can't remember what we've called it, but we have these community guidelines, and they're based a lot on the work that Habitat for Humanity does, and especially Dubois Thomas, who's the neighborhood revitalization director at Habitat for Humanity in Pittsfield. to create sort of what he calls like an oops, ouch process for our meeting, so that if somebody says something racist, which happens, or if somebody says something that is offensive or controversial or not factual, that somebody else from the meeting can actually step in with a oops or an ouch, and we can address it right there. And we actually didn't start with that process, but we, over time, discovered the need that we need to have actually like an agreed upon formal process to be addressing things immediately, and to be making sure that we're actively working on the values that we're trying to state here, I guess. So our working group, which is the major decision-making body, is about 50% residents, 50% community organizations, city representatives, planners, representatives from other organizations that serve people in the community, so environmental and racial justice groups. People provide input based on their lived experience as well as professional experience, so we hold lived experience probably in a higher regard. So the working group, the intention of the working group is to review, approve, and oversee the initiatives from a broader, high-level perspective. Everything is put to a vote. Nothing gets done. Not an edit to the mission statement, an edit to the logo, an edit to, I'll talk about our neighborhood audit program, without the approval of the working group and the subcommittees that are informing our work. This is really important for us because one of the values we wanted to set out with was full transparency, and we want to be transparent to the public, we want to be transparent to our residents, to our working group, to the planning commission, to the state with what we're doing, and having people really like see the progression of our objectives and our goals and our work plans allows people to see our process rather than them giving us input, us going back, making all the decisions, and then coming back and slapping it on the table. That's just not, what we're trying to do here. And again, that's really to increase collaboration with residents, that's to increase the sustainability and longevity of this program beyond 5 years and its usefulness. And then we also have subcommittees of new and or working group members, break off for special projects or interests to advise at a more detailed level. So we've had subcommittees working on our mission statement, value statements, and logo design. We have a neighborhood audit subcommittee. We started a housing subcommittee, which didn't pick up that much steam, but we hope to revitalize this this spring. And we will build these subcommittees based on expressed resident needs and interests as we go. So you can't just invite people to a meeting and say, give me all this information, give me your lived experience and expertise and help me advise this thing that I get paid to do without offering a balance of that. So within our budget, we were really intentional about making sure that the people who participate in our working group can receive a $500 stipend for about 6 meetings a year. We have resident participation rates of about $25 an hour. So for our neighborhood audit program, it's about a 3-hour commitment total. It's a $75 stipend per audit. That includes a 1-hour training. But there's other opportunities to participate through workshops and things like that. Our grant funding includes funding for translation services, transportation, food, childcare, and other needs to increase access. We know you can't have a meeting at 6 p.m. and expect people to show up if you can't accommodate their kids. If you don't serve them dinner, that's just completely inaccessible. It's been tough with Zoom and virtual meeting, and we were able to do a lot more in the summer, and then we're sort of back to dealing with the virtual issues that come with that. But we're really intentional about making sure that things are translated, food is provided, that we increase access, where we can, when we can. And our funder is really adamant too that we pay residents for their expertise. This is something that has also become a little bit controversial, and other, especially state-provided grants and federal grants, you're not often, you survey people or have residents or community members participate in your program, you might be able to offer like a little stipend or a gift card, but offering somebody like a $500 stipend to be part of a working group is really unheard of. We're really grateful that Health Resources in Action, who is a fiduciary for this funding, is really adamant about paying people a good rate, $25 an hour, and healthy stipends to make sure that their time is paid for. Let me see here. The community agreements I talked about to address issues head-on in meetings are in development. We started this project by really focusing on the green environment, but quickly we have grown a lot of the areas of exploration and planning into housing, agricultural work, and community organizing. Changes to the work plan and process are based on expressed community need, so we can evaluate multiple times a year on our process and our initiatives. And we do that based on the working group's expression of, interest and needs, and also, if the community, I have often community members just call me and we'll talk about their concerns, and they're, elevated to the working group and to the decision makers in our group. So I have a couple minutes. I'll talk a little bit about our current nature initiative, which the pilot actually just launched on Monday this week. Sorry, I touched my mic. Which is called Stride and Take Pride, named by one of my favorite residents, Marvin Curry. He's part of the West Side Legends in Pittsfield. But we voted on even the name for this program too. That's how adamant we are. So Stride and Take Pride is, does anybody here know what a walk audit is? So a walk audit is basically a way of formally observing any environment in any place. So the typical walk audit will be done by a trained auditor to evaluate things like sidewalk quality, traffic speeds, pedestrian safety, traffic lighting. So you'll see like a lot of planners do this, a lot of Department of Transportation people do this to assess road quality and needs. So we're sort of taking that concept and expanding it way out into a digital storytelling process, while it's still including some of the more objective measures of safety and nuisance and road quality and housing quality and things like that. So Stride and Take Pride is a digital narrative storytelling program for residents of the Morningside and West Side to map neighborhood needs, ideas, and opportunities through their eyes. This program took a year to plan since we broke it out into a subcommittee with residents, and it's been painstakingly developed and detailed with residents of the Morningside and West Side. Just, what questions do we want to ask? How do we want to collect data? How do we want to present this data once it is collected? What's accessible? Basically, the purpose of this is so that there's a facilitated and completely accessible way for needs in the communities and opportunities in the community to be observed, rather than the current process for the city is that a resident needs to report an issue to the city, which needs to then get processed by a few different people and then potentially assessed based on funding and priority. This way we have all of the priorities from the residents mapped through audio, video, written narrative processes, and it'll all be in this big interactive map where you can hover over data points, pull up somebody's video, listen to their story, listen to their history, listen to their ideas and observations. And it'll also be presented in a formal report so that we can, and this will help because I'm a grant writer, because I work, my job is based exclusively on grants. This helps us justify lots of funding in the future. So we have all of this documentation over the next 2 years of, expressed community needs, data points already collected, data already cleaned, it's already all mapped. Like, you don't have to go through the same process of exploring, all of these data sets and all of this development of narrative every single time we want to apply for one small grant. So that's sort of the strategy here. And it's also going to be much easier for the city and other funders to see, where hotspots are that need to be addressed. So we're really excited about this. We are holding a few trainings for this pilot program. We'll only have 10 to 15 residents trying out our program over the next 2 months. And then we'll work with those residents to do a full evaluation on what worked, how we can be more efficient. And we will be assessing things like green space, access to green space, routes to grocery stores, routes to work, routes to school, kind of the full spectrum of people's day-to-day. And I think that's my last slide. Right on time. Happy to take questions or comments, or if you want to participate with us.
Yeah, thank you for this. I'm organizing a climate party for Pittsfield high school students in April, and I was just wondering if they would be eligible to participate in this.
Absolutely.
And if even maybe someone could come and tell them about this, because obviously they're from all over the city, but Pittsfield High School and County, they're right around.
Yeah, we love that.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. So we are building out a youth work plan right now with 18 Degrees, their youth program director. And we'd love to do that. We have one of our trainers is a city official, Dubois Thomas from Habitat is a trainer, and I'm the trainer too. So any of us I'd love to get your contact information and we can coordinate that. We do encourage younger, depending on age, for people to do it in pairs. Youth can still get their own stipend, but we do encourage, just for safety reasons, people under 16 to do it in pairs if they can, or groups, which are great too. So I love to do that. Yeah?
How do you go about selecting the residents who participate in whatever planning that you're going to do for, like you said, it's 50-50. So this 50%, how do you select these people?
They're self-selected, really. So we presented, the way we started our process to start getting kind of interest building with residents is we met with a lot of existing groups and presented our concept in our recently funded project, and said we're building this working group, especially to habitat groups. Working Cities Wednesdays was a big one we presented at a few times. They're a good partner for us. The RPC groups, we did a lot of social media push through like Westside Legends and the city of Pittsfield, just really trying to get some interest, and really it's residents self-selecting to be part of it, but we're always accepting new people, and this isn't like a closed door thing. So basically, any community member that's contacted me too, or contacted one of our partners about the project, we've always been able to sit down for one-on-one meetings, but also offer them the opportunity to be part of our working group and to receive the stipend if they want to work with us at a deeper level. Yeah, so it's really self-selecting. I would like to, this is one of the reasons why we've decided to be explicit about building out a youth work plan, is that we don't have any youth members from our community, and so we're working with 18 Degrees and some of the schools in Pittsfield this year to kind of build that interest, but this will be a great connection. And I think if people want to try out the audit program and then say like, hey, I like this process, I'd like to be, you know, part of the group that builds this, they can join. Or they can join beforehand too. They're just interested in kind of justice and working in this context. I will say, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
I will say it's 6 meetings a year, but people do hear from me pretty frequently, and so it is somewhat of a commitment. We do expect people who participate in the working group to really contribute their ideas and be honest about the process. But we also have our quieter members that prefer to participate on the subcommittee level and talk to me directly, which is great too. Go ahead.
You said that obviously this plan is not, it's theoretical. It's that you only have so much money and you're not going to be implementing it. What would it take for it to get implemented?
Yeah, well, so after our planning process and the neighborhood audit program starts generating priority projects, priority policy issues, that's sort of what we're working on now, is like what are the priorities in terms of policy and project implementation that can come from this working group and this audit process. What would it take? It takes somewhat developed ideas, some good backup, data and justification, and some people to write some grants or pitch ideas to private funders. We've been approached by some private funders too to start implementing, but we want to go through our process of really truly getting these projects developed with our community members. So yeah, I think we're in the process the first 3 years of this program to get a foundation laid about like what actually we don't. One of the worst things I've seen happen in planning processes is for them to be rushed. We're lucky to have 5 years. We're lucky to be able to be thoughtful. While this is an extremely urgent issue, we're not going to address this huge, not going to be able to address immediately this huge life expectancy gap. But that's why we're trying to be intentional about really the biggest impacts, where the residents really see the biggest impacts happening in terms of policy and projects. And then we'll be grant writing. I mean, that's like my gig. It's what I like to do. I like pitching ideas. I like pitching projects. This is how we employ people at the Planning Commission, and this is how we get some stuff done. So that'll be sort of the last 2 years. We're really focus a lot of our planning time on actually writing grants. Although, I submitted a grant this week. I've submitted a few grants before, which is interesting to submit a grant with a full community process. It's complex, and patience is required. But it's a good process. It's patience, though, and intentionality, I guess. So hopefully we can get some funding, and the city's been a great partner. So hopefully this aids in their decision making too.
So writing grants doesn't count as implementation at this point?
So it would be. So if we find a good funding source for one of the projects that was developed from the community, which I do have a running list of projects that we've already come up with. If a funding source comes up, we apply now. We're not spending the majority of our personnel time, I would say, at the Planning Commission doing that yet. because again, we're not trying to prescribe from our perspective what needs to happen, but I do have a pretty good running list of small projects that can happen as funding opportunities come up. Sorry, I'll go to you first and you, and then you. Yeah.
Can you share some of the resident authored ideas?
Yeah. So one of the ones that's actually been a desire of a lot of residents in the West Side neighborhood for a number of years that hasn't had much movement. So you might be familiar, since you're a West Side resident, at the very end of Francis Avenue, off the Circular Ave, it's up on this really big steep hill. There's a stairwell that is owned by Pittsfield Housing Authority. That is the only access point to get from up on this big hill in the West Side neighborhood, the section of the West Side neighborhood, down to the Big Y and Salvation Army below. It's interesting because if you can't use the stairwell, because it's often not maintained in the winter, it's got huge invasive overgrowth on it, so it's often blocked by vegetation. Or if it's dark and there's nefarious activity happening, you don't use that access point. So you walk an additional almost half mile around to get to the grocery store. So you go down the hill, and then you have to go down a really busy street to access the grocery store. And this is just, an issue that people have, brought up and complained about, understandably. And, it's used some parts of the year and then not used other parts of the year. And so we have just today actually submitted an application to the city to get some engineering done to add lighting, to restore parts of the hillside, to relieve the vegetation, overgrowth, to add, to work with Pittsfield Housing Authority, which has been a great partner after we approached the board, and they've given their enthusiastic support for this application, to come up with a agreed upon maintenance plan. And then also, right at the top of this hill is this empty plot of land also owned by Pittsfield Housing Authority that just has one of the most beautiful views of the city, of the sunset, and of, you can see Bosquet, of the surrounding mountains, and of kind of like the city, the whole city downtown. And to kind of take advantage, part of this project, or this pitch, this proposal, is to make that kind of benches so that people carrying up their big wide bags have a spot to rest and enjoy the view, and then continue on their journey. But that's sort of something you wouldn't know was an issue, or wouldn't know was a vital access point for residents unless you talk to enough of them, and they come together and say, like, you have this issue too, I have this issue. And so where can we find, grant opportunities and even just small funding sources to get some engineering done for things like that. So that's how we sort of add that professional planning service. Hopefully it'll get funded. If not, we've got the whole grant written and ready to pitch to another funding source as soon as it comes up. So we keep all that kind of in our back pocket. So yeah, that's an example. I have a few others, but I'll stop there. You had a question?
About 4 years ago, I heard someone named Tessa Kelly talking about trying to form a park on the west side because the school children needed a safe place to get to school and they were having to cross dangerous streets. Do you know if anything came of that? Did that end up happening?
So I wonder if, Tessa Kelly, she's a landscape architect in Berkshire County. She had a big part in designing with the city of Pittsfield and other community partners the West Side Riverway Park, which I wonder, that park was just opened last year. They just got their, grand opening basically last year. So I wonder if that was, it's really been a long process for that park to get developed. The city had to demolish several houses, restore the banks and area around the Housatonic River, which abuts that park. But yeah, she was a landscape architect on that project. I think that's probably, It's on Dewey Avenue, so it is like a major
Right.
access point for students walking to school in downtown.
Yeah, great.
But yeah, Tessa is part of our team, and she's awesome.
Good.
Yeah, she does really good work. Great. Well, it looks like, oh, you have a question?
How do you communicate what is going on in the working groups as you go through this 5-year process? How do you let the rest of the West Side and Morningside neighbors know, and also the rest of Pittsfield?
Yeah, so we use our partners, at the city through the community organizations, kind of really through social media and their email lists, and basically anybody who's got like a community email list or a slot in, one of their community meetings available, will present live. We do our newsletter, which gets shared widely. That's an area where we can definitely work on. And, it's hard to reach everybody. Like, a lot of people use Facebook, but a lot of people don't. And a lot of people use email, but a lot of people don't. And without being able to do much in-person work on a consistent basis, that's definitely been a big challenge for us. So we're definitely always open to suggestions for that, how to reach a bigger, and doing things like this kind of increases the awareness too. But yeah, that's a challenge point for us, I'd say. But we try to reach as much as we can through emails, newsletters, social media posts, and we don't want to exhaust people with information either. So it's a balance, I would say.
I'm also curious about the balance of sort of how this Ride with Pride program came about in terms of, sounds like there's enthusiasm amongst the residents to do this, but it also sounds like there's such a clear benefit in terms of the information that comes out of that for sort of future grant writing, and is this sort of a process of like the residents and the planners kind of sharing information about like, hey, we need this information, and is this something that how did that come about to get to this point, if you can say that quickly? Yeah.
Yeah, to sort of come up, well, we knew we wanted to collect data, sort of like at the beginning of when we were working with our partners and some of the initial residents at the beginning of this process. We knew we wanted to collect data, and we didn't want to extract data. That's been something that's happened a lot in the Morningside and West Side, is just surveys and like resident input sessions twice a year, or residents have contributed sporadically to plans and processes throughout time, but yeah, we're just like, how can we make this narrative? How can we actually map the Morningside and West Side needs through the perspective of the residents? And then, from our agency, we're like, what an audit process is, what do you all think about this? They're like, well, can we assess things other than, what the CDC or what the Department of Transportation would flag? And we're like, yeah, how can we use digital storytelling, and how can we use video? And there's a lot of good research where I went to school at UMass-Amherst, and I worked with a professor in community health education, who her research is all based, it's on sexual and reproductive health, but we did a lot of work, she did a lot of work, and I just assisted where I could on digital storytelling and narrative storytelling. So we pulled in those features to make it more accessible, so you're not just filling out a form and calling it a day, so that you can actually take your camera and you see what you see. So it was kind of, it's taken us a year just to get to a pilot program with really exhaustive work being done and, constant feedback from our subcommittee, which are awesome people, but it's been a lot of work, a lot of back and forth. The city community development department also had major contributions to helping us formalize how we collected data, so that we could make sure it's standardized with their data, how they like to see their data, to make it easier to view and implement things. Yeah, it's been exhaustive. I honestly can't even remember the first meetings about it, but they're all documented. If you're curious about the notes or cross